In March 2025, Canada shipped $1.4 billion worth of aluminum south across the border. 97% of it went directly into the United States economy. Detroit needed it. Pittsburgh needed it. American factories depended on it to keep operating. That 1 month showed exactly how deeply North American trade had been integrated. Canada and the United States were not functioning like two separate neighbors. They were operating like one industrial system. Quebec's smelters ran day and night, feeding the American manufacturing machine. Then Washington made a decision that began pulling apart decades of that relationship. On June 4, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order that Wall Street did not see coming. Aluminum tariffs on every country jumped from 25% straight to 50%. Canada, the largest supplier of aluminum to the United States, received no exemption, no carve-out, no transition window, and no diplomatic exception as a treaty partner. If you watch Capital Alert, hit subscribe right now because this story only gets bigger from here. The tariff was presented to the American public as a form of economic protection. Washington argued that domestic smelters needed room to grow and compete. On the surface, that sounded like a reasonable national security argument. But underneath that argument, the numbers told a very different story. The United States imports roughly 83% of the primary aluminum it uses. Canada alone supplies nearly 90% of those American primary aluminum imports. There was no domestic replacement sitting ready in storage. American smelters cannot be built, staffed, powered, and made operational in a matter of months. That takes years. So the tariff did not suddenly create American aluminum. It simply made Canadian aluminum far more expensive. The cost of that decision landed immediately on American manufacturers and American consumers. The U.S. Midwest Premium is the surcharge American buyers pay above global aluminum prices. In January 2025, before the tariffs doubled, that premium was 24 cents per pound. By June 2025, it had surged to 60 cents per pound. That was a 150% jump in the regional surcharge in only 6 months. By October 2025, the Midwest Premium had reached a record 85 cents per pound. Then, on November 10, 2025, it broke every previous record in a single night. The U.S. Midwest Premium climbed to $1,950 per ton, the highest level ever recorded. American factories producing cars, beer cans, and aircraft components were the first to absorb the shock. Molson Coors reported a $30 million increase in aluminum costs in just 1 quarter. The Can Manufacturers Institute publicly warned that price increases in 2026 would be severe. Ball Corporation and Crown Holdings, the two largest can makers in the United States, both confirmed pressure on margins. Crown Holdings' CEO acknowledged on earnings calls that aluminum prices had risen sharply. Ball's CFO said direct tariff costs were expected to keep hitting the company's finances throughout 2026. Research from the University of Cincinnati confirmed that canned food saw some of the steepest grocery price increases. Every American picking up a six-pack was paying for Trump's tariff at the store shelf. Every automaker buying aluminum for doors and hoods was paying for it on the factory floor. The Trump administration had designed the tariff to punish foreign suppliers, especially Canada. Instead, the tariff turned into a tax on American industry, paid by American companies and American consumers. While Washington was still describing the policy as a win, Quebec was already adjusting. Canada's response was not emotional. It was not built around anger or public retaliation. It was pure market logic. Canada had ocean access, long-standing European relationships, and hydro-powered green aluminum. Those 3 advantages suddenly became more valuable than any trade agreement on paper. Before June 2025, Europe accounted for just 0.2% of Quebec's aluminum export shipments. That number was basically zero, a rounding error in Canadian trade data. By the second quarter of 2025, Europe's share had jumped to 18% of total exports. That was not a minor shift. That was the structural redirection of an entire industry. Aluminum Alouette made the move that stunned the North American metals market. Alouette, located in Sept-Îles, Quebec, is the largest aluminum smelter in North America. It is 40% owned by Rio Tinto and produces 632,000 tons of aluminum each year. In the first quarter of 2025, only 4% of Alouette's shipments went to Europe. By the second quarter, that figure had risen to 57%. In just 3 months, more than half of North America's largest aluminum smelter was shipping to Europe. The Netherlands received 11,800 tons of Canadian aluminum in April and May alone. That was 74% more than it had imported from Canada during the entire previous year. Shipments to Italy nearly doubled between April and August. Exports to Poland quadrupled. New shipping lanes opened between Quebec and European ports. Rio Tinto's response to the tariff was even more revealing. Instead of paying a 50% tariff to send its own Canadian aluminum south, Rio Tinto stopped doing that. The company began buying aluminum from rival producers to resell to customers in the United States. Think about what that means. A global mining giant decided it was cheaper to buy a competitor's metal than to pay Trump's tariff on its own Canadian production. Simon Latendre, a Rio Tinto spokesperson, described the strategy in careful corporate language. He said the company was redirecting shipments to Europe to maximize value under current conditions. In plain English, that meant the tariff had made America an unprofitable destination. Alcoa, the other major aluminum producer operating in Quebec, also shifted its uncontracted volumes. Around 30% of Alcoa's Canadian output is sold on the spot market rather than through long-term contracts. That 30% became flexible capacity, able to move wherever prices were strongest in any given week. On an October 22nd earnings call, Alcoa's CEO noted that the Midwest premium had reached a level where it could cover shipping costs. But by the time that was said publicly, the shift toward Europe had already been underway for months and had begun reshaping global aluminum flows. The metal that once moved south into the United States was now moving east, and Europe was ready to take it. European manufacturers had been dealing with their own aluminum supply pressure for months. The Rotterdam duty-paid premium had risen more than 50% in 2025 after an Icelandic supply disruption. At the same time, carbon taxes on non-EU aluminum imports were making metal from the Middle East and Asia more expensive. Canadian aluminum fit perfectly into that opening. It was clean, hydro-powered, reliable, and could arrive by sea. Canada's aluminum has one of the lowest carbon footprints in the world, with 96% of production powered by hydroelectricity. That low carbon advantage lined up directly with Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism. European manufacturers facing carbon charges on imports had a strong reason to choose Canadian metal. It was not only competitive on price, it also helped buyers avoid carbon penalties. Meanwhile, Quebec's smelters kept running through the entire disruption. Jean Simard, the head of the Aluminum Association of Canada, confirmed there had been no slowdown and no layoffs. In fact, Quebec's aluminum sector added jobs. Employment in aluminum rose 5% through 2025, even while the broader metallurgical industry in Quebec lost 3.6% of its workforce. Workers in Sept-Îles and Saguenay were busier than they had been in years. Canada did take a hit at the beginning. Producers absorbed roughly $600 million in losses during the first 7 to 8 weeks after the tariff doubled. That pain was real. They had contracts to honor at prices set before the market had fully adjusted, but they honored those contracts, absorbed the losses, and then changed the structure of their business. By the time Washington noticed what was happening, the European routes had already been built. Quebec's aluminum industry had found a new floor, and that floor was supported by European demand. While euros were flowing into Canada, the pressure inside the United States was only getting worse. American manufacturers had spent decades organizing their supply chains around Canadian aluminum. Those systems were not designed to handle a 50% tariff overnight without serious damage. The all-in delivered cost of aluminum in the United States shows the problem clearly. In January 2025, American buyers were paying roughly $2,600 per ton. By October 2025, that same delivered price had climbed above $4,000 per ton. That was an increase of more than 50% in less than 10 months. The global benchmark on the London Metal Exchange barely moved over the same period. The LME price rose only modestly, from around $2,150 per ton in January to about $2,500 by October. The global market was relatively stable. The American market had become its own separate crisis. The gap between global prices and U.S. prices was the direct fingerprint of the tariff. Every dollar in that gap came out of American manufacturers' margins or American consumers' wallets. There was no way around it. The tariff was a hidden domestic tax dressed up as a trade war policy. Ford, one of the biggest aluminum users in the United States, felt the cost on every vehicle. Electric vehicles use roughly 25% more aluminum than traditional combustion engine models. So as America pushed further into EV adoption, its need for aluminum was growing, not shrinking. The tariff arrived at the worst possible moment for the American auto transition. Aerospace companies were exposed as well, with aluminum components representing 15 to 20% of material costs. Ball Corporation, one of the largest makers of aluminum beverage cans, faced constant margin pressure quarter after quarter. The American beverage container industry relies on aluminum cans for nearly 75% of packaged drinks. Every can of Coke, every can of Budweiser, and every energy drink on an American shelf became more expensive. In January 2026, Can Manufacturers Institute President Scott Breen said premiums were sky high and warned that the industry expected larger price increases in 2026 than it had already faced in 2025. That warning did not come from Canada, from critics, or from economists. It came from the companies making the cans. They were telling Washington directly that the tariff was destroying their cost structure. Washington did not change course. Section 232, tariffs on metals, remained in place through early 2026, even after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down broader tariffs in February 2026. Aluminum duties survived. The 50% metals tariff sat outside that ruling and continued to apply with full force. American companies had no legal escape and no obvious political relief coming. The Midwest premium became the industry's nightmare. CME Group analysts confirmed that by early 2026, the Midwest premium made up more than 40% of the all-in aluminum transaction price in the United States. Buyers were paying almost as much in premium as they were for the base metal itself. That had never happened before in the history of American aluminum markets. Across the Atlantic, the situation looked completely different. Canadian aluminum was arriving at European ports at competitive prices. European manufacturers were not paying a 50% tariff on Canadian metal. They were paying market rates. Even though the Rotterdam duty-paid premium was elevated, it remained only a fraction of what American factories faced. Canadian producers were earning better net returns in Europe even after accounting for higher shipping costs. The calculation was simple: ship to Europe at market prices or ship to America and absorb the tariff penalty. Quebec's smelters chose the profitable route, and Quebec's workers kept their jobs because of it. The Aluminum Association of Canada confirmed that smelters were operating at around 95% capacity by mid-2025. That number was remarkable, considering Washington had expected tariffs to weaken Canadian production. The policy was supposed to reduce Canada's competitiveness. Instead, it produced the opposite result. Canada did not beg for exemptions while watching its industry fall apart. It found new buyers. The Netherlands quickly became a major new destination, taking in volumes of Quebec aluminum that had never been seen before. Italy nearly doubled its purchases of Canadian aluminum between April and August 2025. Poland quadrupled its imports during that same period. These were not minor changes on the margins. They were the early signs of a lasting diversification in trade routes. Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism gave Canadian aluminum a built-in pricing advantage. Producers outside the European Union that shipped carbon-heavy aluminum into Europe were facing rising carbon import charges. Canadian aluminum, powered almost entirely by hydroelectricity, carried one of the lowest carbon intensities in the world. For European buyers, Canadian metal offered two benefits at once: dependable supply and lower carbon exposure. That combination was exactly what European industry needed in 2025. Then, the Middle East added another layer of pressure. The conflict with Iran that began in early 2026 disrupted production at Middle Eastern smelters. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz blocked aluminum shipments moving toward both Europe and the United States. Wood Mackenzie projected a global aluminum deficit of 200,000 tons for 2026, with the shortage potentially rising to 800,000 tons by 2028. That made Canadian aluminum even more valuable. Quebec's hydro-powered smelters were producing clean and reliable metal, while Middle Eastern capacity was being interrupted. Canadian producers suddenly held a commodity the world was trying to secure. The London Metal Exchange aluminum price rose 19% in 2026, reaching its highest level since 2022. Prices were being pushed upward from several directions at the same time: tariffs, Middle East disruptions, and rising demand from electric vehicles. Every ton of Canadian aluminum shipped to Europe instead of the United States tightened American supply further. Every load that landed in Rotterdam instead of Detroit pushed Midwest premiums higher. The tariff had created a loop that reinforced itself, and Washington seemed either unable or unwilling to break it. American consumers were paying more. American manufacturers were paying more. American supply chains were becoming more fragile. And Canada's aluminum industry, the industry the tariff was supposed to punish, was adding jobs. The 5% employment increase in Quebec's aluminum sector was not a coincidence. It happened because Canadian producers found higher value markets while keeping production running. The industry that was expected to suffer became the industry that adjusted faster than anyone predicted. Jean Simard of the Aluminum Association of Canada summed it up in one sentence when he said the impact was less painful than expected, but the real problem was uncertainty about the future. That uncertainty was not about whether Canada's aluminum industry could survive. It was about whether Washington would ever return to a rational and consistent trade policy. Canada had already answered its own question by turning toward Europe. The market had already spoken. Washington responded with tariffs, and the market responded with containers heading east. Canada's reaction was not emotional. It was not political theater. It was financial logic. When a 50% tariff turns your largest customer into your least profitable customer, you look for new buyers. That is not betrayal. That is how global commodity markets behave under pressure. But inside the United States, the consequences kept deepening through every quarter of 2025 and into 2026. The construction sector, one of America's largest aluminum consumers, absorbed price increases of 15 to 25%. Window frames, HVAC systems, structural components, all of it became more expensive because of the Midwest premium. Aerospace manufacturers quietly repriced contracts and warned customers about longer delivery timelines. Keurig Dr. Pepper's CFO listed aluminum as a direct cost pressure during a 2026 analyst call. Molson Coors lost $30 million in one quarter on aluminum alone and expected more pressure ahead. These were not small companies barely surviving on thin margins. These were Fortune 500 corporations taking public losses. The tariff that was supposed to protect American industry was pulling billions of dollars out of American industry's own bottom line. The irony was not hidden. It was not buried in technical reports or economic footnotes. It was showing up on earnings calls. America's domestic aluminum production capacity had not expanded in any meaningful way after the tariffs began. The United States still relied on imports for roughly 83% of its primary aluminum needs. Building a new smelter requires enormous capital, years of permitting, and dependable low-cost electricity. None of those realities changed because Washington signed a tariff order on June 4, 2025. The one major announced expansion, a joint venture between Emirates Global Aluminium and Century Aluminum in Oklahoma, would produce 750,000 tons if completed. That plant would nearly double current American smelting capacity, but it would not produce a single ton at the moment American factories actually needed metal. Rio Tinto, meanwhile, was moving ahead with a $1.5 billion low-carbon smelter expansion in Quebec. That expansion was not aimed at America. It was aimed at Europe and at global markets willing to pay a green premium. Canada was investing in more aluminum capacity at the same time America was trying to punish Canadian capacity. The investment signals told the real story that tariff rhetoric tried to hide. Global capital was moving toward Quebec's hydro-powered aluminum, not away from it. Europe's demand for low-carbon Canadian aluminum was creating a commercial logic strong enough to outlast any single tariff decision. Europe's demand for low-carbon Canadian aluminum was building a commercial case that could survive any tariff cycle. The carbon border adjustment mechanism was not disappearing. European carbon rules were only becoming tighter. Canadian aluminum's built-in advantage in Europe was not just a temporary route change caused by Trump's tariff. It was the beginning of a deeper reshaping of global aluminum trade. The Middle East crisis pushed that realignment even faster than Canadian producers had originally expected. With the Strait of Hormuz closed and Middle Eastern smelters disrupted, global aluminum supply tightened sharply in early 2026. Wood Mackenzie's projected deficit of 200,000 tons for 2026 was already being viewed by some analysts as conservative. If the shortage reached 800,000 tons by 2028, it would reshape aluminum flows for a generation. Quebec's smelters, operating at 95% capacity on clean hydroelectric power, were sitting directly at the center of that shift. Canada had found itself in exactly the right position at exactly the right moment in commodity history. The United States, by contrast, had tariffed itself into exactly the wrong position at exactly the wrong moment. American manufacturers were paying record Midwest premiums while global supply was becoming tighter, not easier. The fact that the Midwest premium made up more than 40% of the all-in aluminum price in the United States was unprecedented. No American manufacturer had built that cost structure into its 2025 financial plans. No American automaker had included that level of Midwest premium in its electric vehicle transition budgets. The impact on consumer prices was already visible in grocery data by late 2025. Research from the University of Cincinnati showed that canned foods experienced some of the sharpest price increases across grocery categories. The American consumer standing in a supermarket aisle was paying the invisible tariff tax with every purchase. They did not see the tariff printed on the shelf label. They simply saw higher prices for beer, soda, canned soup, and every other aluminum packaged product. Prime Minister Mark Carney understood the situation and handled it with patience. He created an advisory committee specifically to emphasize Canada's strategic aluminum advantage to Washington. That committee was not a protest movement. It was a negotiating tool built on commercial leverage that Washington could not deny. Canada did not need to threaten the United States with aluminum export bans. The market was already applying the pressure. Every European shipment leaving Septil instead of heading to Detroit made Canada's argument more clearly than any political speech could. Statistics Canada data showed the scale of the change between April and August 2025. Canada's monthly aluminum exports averaged about $848 million during that period, down from the March peak of $1.4 billion. But the total value did not fully show the real change. The destination of those exports had shifted in a fundamental way. The Netherlands, Italy, Poland, and other European countries were now taking Canadian aluminum that American buyers had once assumed would always be available to them. European manufacturers were forming supply relationships, signing contracts, and working Canadian metal into their production systems. Supply relationships created during pressure do not disappear easily. They become part of planning, procurement, pricing, and long-term industrial strategy. Jean Simard of the Aluminum Association of Canada acknowledged that any aluminum sent to Europe had to come away from an existing customer. That displacement was happening in reverse as well. European buyers were replacing American customers in Canadian order books. The longer the tariff remained in place, the deeper those European relationships became. Washington was not only losing a trade argument, it was risking the loss of permanent supply priority. For decades, American manufacturers had first call access to Canadian aluminum because geography and integration made that relationship natural. That advantage was being given away, not by Canada, but by Washington's own tariff policy. And the aluminum story was still not over. Prices were still climbing. Deficits were still expected to deepen. The Strait of Hormuz crisis continued to pressure global supply into mid-2026, with no clear timeline for resolution. Canadian smelters were still running, still shipping to Europe, still adding jobs, and still building new capacity. American manufacturers, meanwhile, were still paying record Midwest premiums. They were still passing costs to consumers. They were still waiting for domestic aluminum capacity that did not yet exist. The trade war was supposed to make Canada weaker and America stronger. The aluminum market delivered the opposite verdict. Canada found Europe. Europe found green aluminum. America found higher prices on the products it manufactures and buys. That is not opinion. That is what the data from Statistics Canada, S&P Global, Bloomberg, and major corporate earnings calls throughout 2025 and 2026 showed. Numbers do not carry political loyalty. Commodity markets do not respond to executive orders the way Washington hoped they would. If this story changed how you think about the true cost of a trade war, share it with someone who needs to understand it. Subscribe to Capital Alert for market stories that go deeper than the headlines every week. And drop a comment below. Do you think Washington will reverse the aluminum tariff, or is this the new normal?